All right, showtime, yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second monthly meeting. Before we start, I'm going to make a few announcements. Last week, the President-elect Gary Hansen, Kathy Bratt, the Associate Director, and myself went to New Orleans for Grassroots, which is the National Leadership Conference, where we met with other 600 leaders from around the country. And we got a lot of ideas from the conference. We got time to network with other chapters and bring some ideas to Long Island. We also met the candidates that are running for 2021. We have elections in LA in May, and we met candidates for secretary, president, and at-large directors. Later on, we will be talking a little bit more about their candidacies. A few announcements of programs that are happening soon in the chapter. This Thursday, the Women in Architecture Committee is collaborating with the National Association of Women in Construction. We're putting together a panel event. It's called Women Reshaping the Construction Industry. If you haven't seen the emails, which I'm sure you did, we sent like 2 today. It's on Thursday at 6:30 at ABC Sun in Hicksville. It's open to all members, even though it's a Women in Construction and Architecture Committee, it's for all of our members. We're going to have credits there, LUs. Also, later on in March, actually March 11, the Emerging Professionals Committee is launching the 2020 mentorship program. We're seeking for mentors to help with this program. Usually we have 20, 25 students. We also have young architects, associates, but we also need the senior or experienced mentors. So if you would like to sign up, please send an email to the EP committee or to myself or to Ann. We really need a few mentors there. Also on March 20, the Emerging Professionals is hosting a newly licensed event. We are going to recognize the associates that got licensed last year. We got about 8 or 9 newly licensed in the chapter, so we want to recognize their achievement. It's going to be at a bar probably, so we will send an invitation soon. We are having our product fair on April 23rd at the Marriott in Uniondale, so save the date. And also in May 28th, we're going to host the first school planning and design conference. It's going to be in collaboration with Nassau BOSAS. We're also talking to NYIT, NYU, Farmingdale State College. It's going to be a full day of seminars and lectures about school design. So that's another good event to attend, and also it's going to provide up to 6 credits, HSW credits. Lastly, every month the chapter joins a visibility network call with National, which is led by our at-large director, Jessica Sheridan. And the goal of this network is to enable communication between AIA National and the components through the Institute. So basically we talked between New York area, Mid-Atlantic, and Virginia's. And I have Gary Hansen, our president-elect. He will report back on those national schools.
Good evening. Okay, so they had the call a couple weeks ago. What they're trying to do nationally is what they're calling the big move. So they want to prioritize it's an issue and align it throughout the AIA. So all the components would then follow along with this, and they announced this last year at the AIA National Convention, and the big move is Climate Action Plan. had 3 goals for the plan. They released a statement. Actually, they released a statement at grassroots, although I didn't take notes on that, so I don't know what the 3 goals were. But you could go on their website, national website. They have that. We'll be doing it through New York State as well. They also announced that the AIA membership is up to 95,000 members. It's the largest ever in our membership history, which is 5% higher than last year. And EPs, the emerging professionals, represent the most growth. The Strategic Council also reported they're asking the AIA if we do not meet the 2030 objective, what happens then? And they brought up a couple of new topics to discuss, like rural issues, mental health. And they're also meeting with the USGBC. They're trying to make the guides more personal versus technical, trying to make it more relevant, and that also goes in with the climate action plan that the AI National is promoting. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. So now we're going to start the lecture tonight. Please welcome Eric Anderson. He will be presenting Long Island, a Material Culture Hearth for American Design and Construction. Eric is an architect and educator with extensive experience in facilities planning and project management for educational and nonprofit organizations, developing instructional, research, support, and residential buildings. Over more than 30 years, he has planned and managed 1.5 billion of facilities for nonprofit institutions with specific responsibilities for master planning, project design, design management, forensic practice, and capital program management. He's a registered architect in New York and West Virginia and holds degrees from Carnegie Mellon University and West Virginia University. He has been awarded the AIA Long Island Educator and Membership Awards, and his research interests include architectural pattern languages, Long Island design and construction precedents, and religious facilities design. Please welcome Eric. Thank you.
Sure, why not? Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Oh, okay. We'll put that down. So, tonight, I'm going to give you a slightly different view about architecture. I struggled as an instructor for many years. Now, Miguel will tell you, right, Miguel?
Yeah.
I ask questions of students at the strangest times. What made you think of that? Or what's your source material? And I'm always kind of interested in where people find design ideas. Now, we talk about form, space, and order. You know, we learn that in architectural theory. We talk about architectural history. But do we look at architecture as part of material culture? So tonight we're going to learn a little bit about material culture. We're going to look at Long Island as a material culture environment. What are the objects of design and construction that exist within our environment? And how can we kind of identify those things that might be significant in the much larger national and international context? I'm going to talk a little bit about transit-oriented development and Marchetti. I had said Moretti, but it was Marchetti's constant. And it was a fascinating kind of idea, but some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight will show you how it influenced the way that Long Island grew. And then look at things that I'm going to be working on in terms of research to kind of identify the broader material culture of design and construction. My goal is to develop a course that architects and non-architects can take to study the built environment around them. And it's going to combine material culture, human geography, and aspects of architectural design and construction that would be of interest to potential clients and potential designers. So that's the point of departure I'm using for this evening's presentation. And of course, there's the lovely disclaimer. So a little bit about my interest in material culture. I have a degree in architecture, but I also have a degree in technology education. And as a graduate student, I was interested in architectural pattern languages and their potential impact on teaching owner-builders how to build their own homes. So if any of you, how many of you are familiar with Christopher Alexander? Okay, so you kind of know that what Alexander's proposition is that there are universal rules that cultures develop in order to create a room, a house, a neighborhood, a community, a city. And he started down the path of trying to merge the idea of design and material culture studies so that anybody can begin to assess and use some basic understanding of the objects, systems, and technology around them to create a built environment. So material culture studies basically looks at the totality of human endeavor. It could be a building, it could be objects, it could be construction systems, it could be roads, it could be vehicles. It looks at the meanings that people put into these systems and interacting with them on a daily basis. And then it looks at how they contribute to the overall well-being or disillusion of a society. So the way that I'm going to talk about architecture and construction tonight is that they're markers for social and technological prowess and evolution. And I think one of the things that here on Long Island that people have missed is we actually have a lot of things to be proud of on Long Island when it comes to architecture and design. We have a lot of books, like the Architectural Guide that the chapter sponsored several years ago. We have books on modern architecture in the Hamptons, Fire Island. Carolyn Zelinsky wrote a very good book on modern architecture. We have the Gardens of Eden that talks about communities, but they kind of stayed within their silos. And they didn't begin to see where there were logical connections. And it goes back to talking to students. In high school now, we don't necessarily have the kinds of courses where we challenge students to say, do you look at what's around you beside your phone and see what's going on? And when you go into a community, what are some of the things you should be looking for? And I'm concerned that unless we begin to make some presentations to bring those connections together, we wind up with people that maybe just zero in on, like, I'm going to design a mausoleum, or I'm going to design a police station, without seeing how those objects are valued by the communities and the cultures that they reside in, and how they connect to the various systems that cultures create to move people around, to make economic activity work. So, why? Gary!
Why are you calling me?
I'm calling you. Why, just what I've said about material culture, do you see that as something that we should teach in high school, or that in a college environment, especially like at Farmingdale State, where we're teaching architectural technology, that we should at least begin to let students think about those connections?
Absolutely, because we're saying that architecture is an art form of its time, so they should be looking at what's around them in their time.
So Michael Morabilla. Oh, by the way, tonight, if I see you, I'm probably going to have a conversation with you at some point during the presentation. You have 2 or 3 of my students working for you now. Do they see how buildings fit into the social and physical conventions of Long Island? Or how are they acquiring that knowledge?
You know, it's over time. I think they have to put the pieces together. So, you know, they are seeing it, but, you know, as apprentices, it's a developing process.
And Claude, I would be remiss if I didn't speak. Is social, technological, and aesthetic markers important for people to at least categorize or catalog as they're developing a design they can?
It's important for architects and their clients to look at their projects in context of the property and the community that's located in. So it is a major issue to be considered as one is proceeding with design and implementation of that client's program.
So we want to find out what the precedents are. I think that the impact of precedents on formation and context are very important. And then how technology supports the use of those precedents is really important. I think that's a struggle that we all have with people that we're mentoring. You know, how do they learn how the selection of framing systems and materials will lead to a successful project or create chaos in the design of a project? How do we kind of bring all those things together? I know in a practice environment, it's hard to think at that level. So in an academic environment, should there be different kinds of preparation other than the traditional kind of survey of architectural history from the Egyptian period forward? Or when we talk about theory, you know, and there are many theories that have evolved since the Renaissance, are they useful in today's practice of architecture? And should we maybe supplement that with a snapshot of how social markers for design technology and community formation may affect some of the choices or ideas that we generate for clients or to solve problems. Now, does anybody know what this is? I'll give you $1 if you guess.
Is it a water tower?
Yes, but where?
Chicago?
Yes! Here. Come here. Come on up. Okay. Now, somebody in a community not far from Chicago looked at that water tower, which survived the Great Chicago Fire. It was one of the few structures left standing, and said, you know, we could use this in our business. So, after trial and tribulation, the White Castle Corporation stole most of the details, formed a construction company, and patented a building system to basically take this imagery, this icon, and adopt it to project strength of their business, the strength of the slider. Yes, John?
What I see there is sacred and profane.
Absolutely. That's why it says reinterpretation.
That's-
But they were very honest, right? There's the water tower, and here are all their buildings. And they got a patent in 1930 to basically build the building and reuse it from place to place. And it was portable, so they could, if it didn't work in one location, they could take it down and put it out. All right, everybody knows this.
Crystal Palace.
Everybody knows this icon. This is a famous Long Island icon. Robert Venturi basically made an entire career of comparing duck to shed. Decorated shed. Okay? And here we are, the Longaberger building in Ohio. I guess this is the logical conclusion of being too figurative. They just, by the way, they went bankrupt, and now they're trying to figure out how to readopt it. this building.
Pick it up and lift it, pick it up and move it.
Red button handles.
But, my point is, Venturi used something that was built locally to start a whole movement that led to postmodernism. Tonight, I'm going to show you that there is actually more figurative architecture that was much earlier than the duck that is, that used to reside on Long Island. And the Montauk Lighthouse, very famous. It's used in logos all over the place. It too has been adopted at the Welcome Center as kind of like an architectural marker and focal point. So we have a lot of precedents for objects being interpreted by architects for people to begin to become familiar and organize how they think about their relationship to buildings. Now, I think I'm not going to put up the large version, but a lot of our clients and students, they don't see architecture as form, space, and order. They see a collection of styles and of objects. And it's my contention that perhaps in getting them to form, space, and order, that we need to organize these objects to begin to deal with human geography, physical geography, its interaction with systems of transportation, economics, and give them some basic relationship of how architecture is engaged in social purpose and social context. How am I doing, Miguel?
Great.
That's good. I just want to make sure he's the quality control guy. So, places acquire meaning through human intervention and transformation, manufacture, fabrication. So we want to raise architecture to basically be markers for societal values and aspirations. And we want to make sure that our communities, our architecture, and infrastructure all kind of work together to reinforce that. So, about a year ago, I said, how can we begin to teach our students how to look at Long Island, because they can drive around, they can go to White Castle and get a sack and then go to places and begin to look at artifacts and places that will begin to bring some sense of order to their understanding of the environment. What we need to know about Long Island is that, first of all, it's not really an island. It's an isthmus that has a small separation from the land, and it was formed when Wisconsin came down to visit. They left a lot of rock in two places and then went back. But the geology, or the geography and geology of the island is such is that it helped organize how the island was going to be settled when Europeans came to establish permanent settlements and organize economic activity. And the things that you need to know is that the largest prairie east of the Mississippi was here on Long Island, 60,000 acres. There are two glacial moraines that basically separate north from south. If you begin to think a little bit about how Long Island is today, we can see that sprawl kind of concentrated itself on the major part of the South Shore. High-end communities and homes kind of clung to the coves. And then we had a series of resorts that became permanent settlements that have pockets of high-end homes. Why did that happen the way it exists now? Well, my contention is that in working with the layout of Long Island and then beginning to look at how architectural ideas came in from Europe and how transportation evolved and how the economics of our island kind of evolved, that we wound up with a series of conditions that brought certain ideas right up to the front. So the first thing we need to know is that there were two major influences in the New York region, the Dutch and the English. If you're not familiar with the idea of cultural hearths in folk housing, which is a further kind of refinement of the idea of the house as an object of material culture, there are basically three hearths on the eastern seaboard. New England, because all of those ideas came from Yorkshire and the parts of England that had the beginnings of a post-medieval construction tradition. In Pennsylvania, we had the Swedes and the Germans with log structures. And then in Maryland, coming down to the coast of Florida, which was a Spanish area, we had high-end plantation structures that represented the estates that those settlers were coming through. Look at the New York region, which is right there. It's kind of a hole, and that's because it was hybrid, for one of the better terms. That basically, this is where two cultures met. We had the Dutch in the Hudson River area, going up the Hudson, and in what we now know as Kings and Queens County. The English, once they got to Massachusetts, they had some issues amongst themselves in terms of religious and political ideology, and you had groups of settlers come over to both the North and the South Fork. It was the North Fork first, then the South Fork, and then into the Smithtown, head of the harbor area. And these areas began to develop specific ideas with regards to architectural patterns that had an impact when they were established all the way through the post-war period. Our community formation and planning, because of the locations of these hearths, were impacted in the way that the economy of the island, because the economy of Long Island inverted sometime in the middle of the 19th century. I'm going to show you how and why, and how that affected how simple resorts became long-term communities, and how hinterland areas became opportunities for post-train settlement. And then obviously there are certain features of technology and sustainability in design and construction that were established here on Long Island that found their way into the overall national scheme of developing post-war suburban settlements. So the ideas that I'm going to present tonight will talk about intermodal transportation and the evolution of transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development is not a 20th century idea. It started as far back as 1869 here on Long Island. And there are two key examples that I'll discuss. There's resiliency and seasonal impact in vernacular architecture forms. And I'm going to go through some of those ideas that kind of proliferated from Long Island. We have the resort communities of the early 20th century, and we'll talk about the 19th century version of the Hamptons and its impact on how communities evolved, especially on the South Shore. Then the Duck, because it wasn't the first, and the figurative example that I'll show you shows that as the economy changed on Long Island and things tried to get bigger and better, people were seeking a relationship to ideas that went beyond the traditional ideas of form, space, and work. Then Moses, Marchetti, and suburban infrastructure. How a constant that basically has existed for 4,000 years affected the way that Long Island communities grew and developed. And then finally, we're going to talk about Levittown, modern suburban homes, how federal intervention of mass production finance affected the adaptation of the basic Cape, and why, you know, we know that we have this conflict right now with this potential government intervention in design. It's not new. It was prevalent through the 1930s, and it affected housing throughout the United States. It's just that because of the nature of urbanization in our region, we were first, and we set a model, and it got exported everywhere, everywhere. So that's what I'm going to try to cover in the next hour and some odd. So we had examples from New Netherland of basic Dutch and colonial vernacular structures. Primarily ours were rural. This is a good example of the Montauk House in Ridgewood. By the way, the drawings are from the Historic American Building Survey. If you're ever trying to teach some of your intern architects how to look for style and detail, they're online. You can download the drawings. I think on Long Island we have close to 100 buildings that have been documented this way. You can still document buildings this way. I would think that something like the duck, for example, should be in the Historic American Building Survey. When I show you the figurative example from Brooklyn, you'll understand why. Look at the Montauk House. You've seen houses like this. It's a modified gambrel building, and we can look, especially in the examples that I'm going to talk about from Sears, of how that particular style became a marker for pre-war middle-class housing. Strathmore out in Stony Brook has certain aspects of this form, but it's not too prevalent because the English were much more successful in spreading their ideas about vernacular architecture. Why? Well, like the Dutch, they had very simple forms, and it says southern and northern, but we can look at both of these, and I would say that the southern represents a model of a simple house from Yorkshire, whereas the northern form is more of a Midlands form and would have been assigned to people with greater amounts of wealth. And this is a good example of a salt box. It burnt down in 1940. That's a picture of it before it burnt. We associated this kind of structure with ideas of quaint villages on the eastern end of Long Island. And we can see lots of these kinds of houses built throughout Long Island. And I believe even John Howard Payne wrote a song about this that became very popular in the 19th century. So, whereas the salt box was focused on New England, because of the East End's prominence in whaling and fishing, this house became the house of the people that had money. And very simply, it was environmentally sound. You put the back part of the roof towards your prevailing winds. It had a large central hearth, and it limited the amount of glass that was used on the north sides of the buildings. It could be built easily out of the lumber that we had, and going back, because it only had one story in the back, you had to pay less tax. One of the ideas of this house was that this was a tax avoidance strategy for the colonies, which I was very surprised about, and I just thought it was interesting that they would consider this to be a 1.5-story home, not a 2-story home. The Cape Cod house on Long Island became the more prevalent home for the farmers that were living in a subsistence way in the eastern part of Long Island. And this is just survey of houses that came as far west as Hempstead, could be found in Middle Island, Smithtown, and Northville. For the most part, these houses have central hearths, they don't have central halls, very limited circulation, and very limited privacy. If you look at the house, it basically has 3 rooms on the ground floor. One would have been the kitchen and perhaps work area. One would not, we wouldn't call it a parlor, and it might have a bed chamber in it for the parents, and then the other rooms would have sleeping quarters for the family. In this size house in the 1750s, the average number of people in a house this size was 13. By the time we get to Levittown, upon which the Cape is based, we're down to 4. So their view of a Cape would be much different than ours because of the density of occupancy. And do you think they would be so imbued with the tradition? They wouldn't know. They would be concerned about imposing as much space economically as they could and heating it. So one of the things that we need to look at when we look at architecture as objects is that level of dissection of meaning. How do we sense what the original idea was, and when we modify it or we use it to generate a series of ideas, what are we changing in the intent? So, Long Island, pre-Revolutionary War, basically had an urban core that was concentrated on the lower end of Manhattan Island and perhaps at the ferry stop at Brooklyn. And then there were a series of farms that provided fresh produce that were not much farther than what we would call the Queens-Nassau line now. And then we had a hinterland that basically was a series of subsistence economies based on fishing and grain farming. There was really no vegetable farming taking place out there. And there was no easy path to get from the east to the west. There were a series of Indian trails, like the Sunrise Highway, which was one of the primary trails. But there were no other real roads going east to west. So most of the economic activity on Long Island in the hinterland stayed in the hinterland when we were looking at foot or horse as the primary method of travel. So, when we look at the core, transportation to and from work, there was no work in the primary dwelling, whereas in the hinterland, we have transportation to and from live-work areas. There might have been an internal economy between the fishermen and the grain people. There were mills out there grinding the grain. There were small areas where you could hunt and bring the meat in and have it processed. But there was basically no connection really east to west except for the old trails. Now, when foot was the primary form of travel, and that was until we got basically to the medieval period, the most people would go to hunt, gather, or walk to work, whatever that work was an hour. And Marchetti basically got together with somebody and looked at settlement patterns in Europe over a period of 4,000 years and determined that the only thing that really changes the hour is the mode of transportation. People don't want to move more than an hour in any direction for basic live, work activities. Think about your own commutes. How many people are upset that they may have to commute more than an hour to work? Doesn't it suck? You know, when I got back my 2 hours, I left the city and went to Rockville Center. It was like getting my whole life back. But we're not opposed to traveling 2 to 4 hours for recreation, are we? Because it's part of the journey. And so does it make some sense that we want that journey to be pleasant, that perhaps there should be design to kind of get to the idea of, I'm going on a journey, I anticipate good things, I arrive, I recreate, I relax, and then I come back. So we have this competition, don't we, between 1 hour and 2 to 4 hours. And when we look at Long Island, going back to the urban and hinterland thing, in the pre-revolutionary period, foot and ferry, we could probably maybe walk 5 to 7 miles. Stagecoaches let us get out in 4 hours to Hicksville. To go all the way out to Montauk would be 3 days. So as transportation improved, then the range of how people saw potential opportunities to place permanent settlement and then recreational activities changed. And it's important, I think, if you're looking at, for example, transit-oriented development, I would propose that if I were living at the Ronkonkoma hub and I was taking a train to New York, that would probably be the limit of where I would live, because that's about an hour and 15 minutes. Patchogue, which is another 20 minutes away by car, would be a 2-hour ride because of the way that rail line comes in and goes into Jamaica and then the city. And so, do we put transit-oriented development everywhere? Or do we need to look at the core and hinterland relationships of basic locations for transit-oriented developments? Are the developers doing that? Are the planners doing that? Think about, I have a friend right now who's an owner's rep that's looking at developing a combination museum and apartment complex in Riverhead. He actually has hit this at the right time because they're going to spend $3 billion on a collider. The Conic Bay will probably build another piece if they buy the Catholic high school that was closed. And then they have EPCAL. That's a prime location for transit-oriented development. And all the places I just listed are less than an hour away by automobile, which is our primary means of conveyance up in that part right now. So I think it's important that as you look at both the history and the opportunity to develop ideas, that you look at the history of how transportation evolved as a system and begin to see its impact on how communities changed over a period of time. And for Long Island, we can say that we've basically been here and here since 1630. So that's what? 290 something years. It's not a big period of time to look at, but there's been a tremendous amount of change. The way we move, the way we enclose space, the kind of cities we build. Prior to 1860, this is the focal point of economic activity in the area. Grain farming throughout the middle of the island, and then fishing, whaling, and grain at the end. So that really, they can move their grain maybe from here, and some of the other grain stays where it is or goes to the villages that are engaged in fishing and whaling. Two things change. I just want to go back for a minute. In this area here, the Erie Canal is built, and all of a sudden, the economics of grain farming is destroyed on Long Island because it's cheaper to bring grain from western New York by boat than it is to come across the island by horse. So you begin to see a change. And the change happens just about the time that we begin to see the extension of railroads, the completion of turnpikes, and the development of market-based railheads in this part of Long Island. And we see vegetable farming now becoming important because New York City has grown from 100,000 people at the beginning of the 19th century to 400,000 to 500,000 people. And they need an idea for fresh produce. And the railroad evolution reflects that change. You can see the first part built in the 1830s, its extension in the 1850s to Port Washington, comes out to western Suffolk in the 1870s, and then 1890s and 1870s begins to extend out for recreational purposes. The only thing that's not out of the ordinary evolution was the main line to Greenport. And that's because it wasn't built to serve Long Island. It was built to connect New York to Boston. At its time, when it was built in the 1840s, it was a high-speed line. The train went at 50 miles an hour. It took 8 hours to get across Long Island, because that had a stop for water and fuel. And then you took a ferry up to New London, and then up. That was the fastest way to get there, until they built a railroad through Connecticut and then Western Hills, which seemed to be an impediment. The 1830s technology was not by the 1850s. So, as transportation began to evolve, we begin to see resort establishment. First, as stagecoaches became more common between 1800 and 1850 and the construction of turnpikes, we see resort communities at Coney Island and in what we would call the Five Towns area in the Rockaways. By the time we get to trains and trolleys, we see recreation move to places like Merrick, Seacliff, Babylon, and Jones Beach, which was then called High Hill. And then obviously, when we have modern trains that go out in the 1890s, we begin to see the creation of much more focused recreational homes in Montauk, Southampton, and so forth. Again, all working on the idea that people will travel 2 to 4 hours to recreate. So we need to take a look at the history of transportation to begin to see how recreational opportunities existed. Stagecoach, trains and trolleys. Now you can see the overlay of how, the key systems for movement on Long Island worked with these shifts in recreational activity. So, one of the larger hotels of the early 1820s was built at Coney Island. This is a photo from just about the turn of the century before it was torn down. It was a very simple place. People went to the seashore to enjoy the waters and the air. And wealthy New Yorkers and people who lived in the Heights would come out and stay for the weekend. The resorts grew quickly, and they adopted some of the more fashionable aesthetics of the 19th century. Second Empire, the Italian Renaissance, and the Spanish Revival. And we begin to see this was I think a 1,500 room hotel that dominated Coney Island in mid to late 19th century. Okay, look for it. This was one of the first pieces of figurative architecture in the United States. I think it does predate the Margate Elephant down in Atlantic City. But this building was built to be a hotel. There's the plan. It had a cigar store in one of the legs, which I would have liked. And when Coney Island became seedier as the trains came out of Manhattan, this reportedly was a house of ill repute. But this was a way for their White Castle management to kind of bring attention to itself. The more pedestrian manner was to build much larger hotels. This was a 3,000 room hotel in the Rockaways. This was the original Long Beach Hotel. It burnt down in 1908. And Long Beach, after this fire, Senator Reynolds decided, as automobiles were becoming popular in the early 20th century for the wealthy, was to take the idea of building large beach resorts and begin to build communities that were geared more to people that needed weekend homes. And so he built the first phase of Long Beach for the wealthy. And you can see the promenade and the cars on the lower left. And then realizing that people of modest means needed places, he started developing the West End and small bungalows. And then by the 1920s, built the Lido Club Hotel, but that's a much more modest facility than the original beach resorts that were appealing to the growth of New York City. By this time, people had other options besides Long Beach. They could go out to Montauk, they could go up to Shoreham, to Belterre, and to places on the North Fork. And by the 1920s, the idea of resort architecture became a little bit more articulated. This is Venetian Shores in Lindenhurst, and it was developed on the idea that a lot of these hotels had a kind of breezy architectural style to them, and the idea was to develop lots and build Italian Revival or Spanish style homes that would fit. And of course, they laid this all out right in about 1928, 1929. So these lots were not developed and sat there idle until after World War II. The resorts, because of the changes in transportation, in fact, Coney Island now didn't need hotels. You could just take the subway down here by 1910 to 1930. It lost its hotels. And you begin to see bungalows with year-round residents occupying the Rockaways, Five Towns, and Coney Island. You see these beach resorts, and there were small hotels in Merrick and Montauk and Babylon. You see people now being able to take the South Shore Railroad, which was completed in the 1870s, going to the city and work. So now you begin to see people who had managerial level means to travel into the city. And then obviously, we don't see the development of long-term primary residence mixed with secondary residences in Southampton, Wainscott, and places east to Montauk until the beginning of the 1930s. That was still travel time that was unacceptable for people to consider it as a primary residence. And you'll see the Colony and the work of Atterbury pushed throughout the East End with these small enclaves so that people could travel together on weekends. So trains and trolleys, once they became ubiquitous on the west end of Long Island, basically allowed speculative development all the way out to Deer Park and Dix Hills. Intentional communities on Long Island stand alone, but have some impact on the ideas for planned communities. Gravesend, Seacliff, and Merrick. Gravesend,
Eric,
yes.
I think you should include Freeport in your resort community.
At some point I will, but that's where I was more focused on large-scale development at that point, and then its devolution into much shorter more primary dwelling space. Freeport was a mix. My grandfather owned land in Freeport in the 1920s.
You got a lot of big houses there that the Hollywood people,
Absolute Guy Lombardo and so forth. I haven't done enough research on that particular community yet. Gravesend was established by Dame Moody, who is a religious refugee from New England. And her contribution was a form of zoning in Long Island, in that private property surrounded common yards. It was set up as a defensive measure because there were still Native Americans living throughout the South Shore, and they wanted to protect their assets. So this was one of the first forms of planned communities on Long Island, which then led several years, decades later, to the camp meeting grounds. The Methodist Church went and bought encampments both on the North Shore and down in Merrick. These were tent cities that had focused religious activities, not unlike a Chautauqua. This is Merrick. For those of you familiar with Merrick, this is the area known as Tiny Town, and that's a picture of a typical revival. Those properties were converted from tents to small homes. And these are two examples of the types of small homes you would find in each community. And then there were experimental communities, Modern Times and Fort Salonga. Modern Times, which is now known as Brentwood, was established by a group of people that were into creating a separate economic sphere from their neighbors. They had their own currency. They would budget a certain number of hours that you could trade for goods and services, and they were also polygamous. Their contribution to Long Island was that they experimented with some of the more experimental forms of housing that were available in the 1850s. And the Upland House is a good example of the octagonal houses that were promoted by Orson Fowler's A Home for All. He basically determined that you could enclose the same amount of space, you could use the same perimeter to enclose more space. He had flat roofs to collect rainwater. He basically established central heating. He had flues and air ducts to bring the heating up into the living spaces, and by 1852 was promoting the use of concrete, one of the first people to basically use concrete in residential construction. And that's a typical floor plan where you can look at the ground floor, which was the utilities and all the places that generated heat, and then the living areas and bedrooms, which were up on the first and second floors. We also had the Colony, which was a focal point of activity for Coker and Frey, who are well-known international style architects. They were responsible for the Canvas House, which was an experiment in alternative forms of building enclosure. They contracted with a cotton manufacturer to create a weatherproof cotton covering for the building. They had small panels that were insulated with mineral wool, and the entire building was set up on pilotes, in the style of Corbusier. They kept this building up for a few years just to look at how it would weather and if it were a good alternative to using wood. There's very little wood except for the roof and the floor in this building. And then, obviously, for those of you that went to NYIT, the Illuminator House, which was built on Round Swamp Road, and was a fine example of both looking at engineered components for housing, and that's a wall section to show how they used chipboard, a corrugated covering, and then simple, not even 2x4s, but simple wood struts. It was installed on the Harrison estate and was moved to NYIT. Then they proposed to move to Sunnyside, and it wound up where Frey and Coker did most of their work, the remainder of their career, out in Palm Springs. And so the work that they did in the Fort Salonga and Huntington areas was a launching point for a major modern style in the United States. Just as, and I'll talk about it at the end, Harry Hohauser. Has anybody ever heard of Harry? Harry was an architect in the Five Towns. Harry worked in the city. Harry did Art Deco buildings in the city and out here. Moved to Miami Beach and basically designed over 300 Art Deco buildings in Miami Beach. So the link of Art Deco, Long Island as a hearth for modernist and Art Deco work, exists. This is just some of the technical innovations that the Illuminator House had. Gary, did you have a chance to go into the Illuminator House? Anybody at NYIT graduate? No, not at all.
Did they ever finish it? They were building.
Well, they had to disassemble it. The story
They
is,
took it to Central Islip, but never,
no, they finished it.
oh, they did.
Then NYIT sold the land. They proposed to put it up in Sunnyside. The community board said, no, it's too ugly. And Palm Springs said, we'll take it, it fits. And Michael Schwartz, yeah, the foundation bought it out. And it's being re-erected as part of a modern compound of buildings for a museum. So, intentional communities and experimental communities provided some parts for other kinds of work to develop in other parts of the country. But the birth of transit-oriented development on Long Island can be traced to two areas, Steinway Village and Garden City. Garden City was first. A.T. Stewart was a department store magnate. In fact, had built the largest department store of his time in Manhattan. Garden City was developed as a community of rental houses for his employees. It was not meant as a weekend retreat. So it could considered to be one of the first transit-oriented worker-based developments in America. And it predated the Garden City movement. So there is some discussion that Ebenezer Howard, who wrote a book at the end of the 19th century on garden cities and how small villages that are economically self-contained, that provide economic activity, can work with larger, more established cities. Well, Stewart did it, and he even went and built a railroad spur off the Long Island Railroad to bring his materials and his workers out to the village. That line will become especially useful in the 1940s and 50s when Levitt is building his community, because he resurrected the line, brought it out to Bethpage, and used it to bring in his materials. I'll explain what materials and how he brought the materials in. But as we all know, that Garden City had a series of revival styles that were very popular at that time. Stewart wanted to give his workers and his managers a complete suburban organized experience. He wanted to control everything, the waterworks, the police, the architectural quality, and I guess the village still does that. And it set a pattern for the residential park movement of the early 20th century, which is contemporaneous with the City Beautiful movement from the Chicago World's Fair. Steinway Village was a more urban expression of that idea. The Steinways built Steinway Village towards the end of the 19th century. Steinway was instrumental in not only building worker housing and a complete series of community facilities, he was the impetus for extending the trolley system up into that part of Queens and worked to get the 59th Street Bridge built so that his workers could go to and from Manhattan where they had the showroom. So Long Island has a very solid history of employee-sponsored transit-oriented development to sustain and grow their economic activity. It set patterns for later residential development as the train and trolley system we looked at earlier grew. There were landscape and architectural controls, and it was influenced by the Chicago Exposition of 1893. And so when we look at when those communities were developed, Laurelton, Belrose, Long Beach, Venetian Shores are a lineage right from about 1908 right through 1920. So 40-year period of those kinds of communities on the South Shore growing. And then we have Forest Hills, followed by Plandome, Muncie Park, Belterre, Shoreham, and Sunnyside Gardens that were a little bit different. The communities on the left were more speculative. These communities were not unlike Gravesend and the camp meeting areas, that they were more intentional. Forest Hills Garden, which this is an aerial view drawn by Grosvenor Atterbury, was sponsored by a nonprofit corporate foundation, the Sage Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation. It was not built as a community for just managers. It was a mixed community in the style of Steinway Village for both workers and managers. And Atterbury, a traditional Beaux-Arts architect, actually patented a system of precast construction pieces to build most of the buildings in this village. So he was leading, thinking about how can we bring both quality of design and control the cost of construction. Forest Hills was built in the early 20th century. This is just some of the images that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The hotel at the top, a detached home in the upper right, and then worker quarters down below. Sunnyside Garden, which was developed by Henry Wright and Clarence Stein, a little bit more dense, but yet had very strict controls on the use of landscaping, walkways, and parking around the village. They used lessons from this to develop some of the first automobile-specific suburbs in Radburn, and one that I'm still doing research on. They actually made a proposal for Millbrook in Valley Stream, which would have set a pattern for residential development on Long Island that would have supplanted what the FHA did in the 1930s with their specific guidelines for neighborhood development. And then, obviously, Muncie Park. Now we have Harry here. Muncie Park was developed for teachers, was Plandome for teachers? Plandome. These areas, Plandome and Muncie Park, had very specific goals in terms of who would live there, how it would look. They used some of the ideas from Riverside in Chicago. They used some of the thinking that Olmsted used in the planning of Central Park, to use curved streets to slow down traffic and to make for a safe pedestrian environment. They were looking for a very specific type of architectural scale, and the village still maintains that very strictly, don't they?
Looks exactly like that.
Wow, there you go. Following that residential park era, we see that railroads and trolleys are now crisscrossing Brooklyn, Queens, and Nassau County. And we begin to see the development of small, when I say small, anywhere from 100 to 1,000 houses. What truncated the development of these communities was the Depression. What also hindered the development of these communities was that in the days prior to the FHA, basically you put about 50% of the price of the house down before you got a mortgage. And so housing was not for the masses, it was for people that had secure employment, were generally managers or upper middle class. Merritt, Valley Stream, Midwood, Richmond Hill, Williston Park, and Massapequa are all good examples of builders on Long Island, and they were small-scale builders. They weren't Levitts. They were people that may be building 5 to 20 houses a year. Begin to experiment with prefabrication and kit homes to speed up and increase the number of houses that are being delivered in a community. So, for example, Chatlos came up with a happiness home, which for the time was a relatively inexpensive home. He was going to build 1,000 of these in Williston Park. What cut him off? He started in 1926, 3 years later, done. But if you were to drive to Williston Park, very simple American colonial revival style homes. In Massapequa Park, the builder of the first phase of Massapequa Park had looked at contracting with Sears to put in 1,000 of these style Sears kit homes, the Verona model. The upper right is an example of one of the 100 that went in. An interesting note was that Massapequa Park, in part, was developed because an airport was abandoned in the middle of the village. And you'll find specifically in Nassau County, going back to the idea that transportation influences how houses get placed on Long Island. In the middle of Nassau County, there were a series of private fields that were also developed as mini resorts or country clubs. And those parcels, and they were anywhere from 10 to 20 to 100 acres, were the land banks that were used by people like Levitt and the developers in the 1950s and 60s to begin to fill in Nassau County. So again, and that's an area where I still need to do more research. Airports and private airplane flying became a recreational activity from 1910 through about 1940, and Nassau County had a series of clubs that permitted people to fly in, stay there. They had hotels, lounges, and small bungalows associated with those facilities. Massapequa Park took one of those airports that were derelict and used it to develop the work. So, turnpikes, the railroad, Eastern Parkway, the Motor Parkway, the State Parkway system, and the Expressway all had a major impact on how Long Island communities and ultimately the selection of homes, styles, were made. I just want to say, I'm not going to talk about turnpikes and the Long Island Railroad at this point because we're moving into the late 19th, early 20th century, and the three roads that I've highlighted are really important in terms of their impact as systems in our material culture. Eastern Parkway was the first parkway in the world. Designed by Olmsted, it separated through traffic from local traffic. There was no limited access. It was designed as a park experience, and it kind of worked in with that residential park movement that was starting to evolve at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th. And that's a section of the plan from the parkway, and those are two pictures. The Motor Parkway, which we all know, for those of you that live in Suffolk County, there's still 13 miles. It was the first limited access highway in the world. And it went from the Queens border to Ronkonkoma. The ultimate goal was to build it all the way out to Riverhead. The only reason I know that is that the Vanderbilts had a villa on a place called Deep Pond, which is now a scout camp. And that burnt down in 1909 and was in one of the fire safety magazines because it was part of a wildfire. But they were acquiring land all the way out, and this road was not designed for commuting. This was a recreational road. The primary purpose of the road was to serve the Vanderbilt Cup race. And like a turnpike, you had to pay to get on this road. And by the time the road closed in the 1930s, people were not really using this road. It went bankrupt because it connected nothing to nothing. It went right through that. That's part of the Hempstead Plains that had not been built out yet. When I talk about that 60,000 acres, that 60,000 acres basically was in place until about the 1930s. And of course, they hired John Russell Pope, who designed the Jefferson Memorial, to do a series of structures on the road and a restaurant at the terminal point in Lake Ronkonkoma. Robert Moses, who wouldn't buy this parkway, picked up on the idea and built his own series of structures, starting with the gas stations, and kind of brought that idea into the design of the state parks, with Jones Beach being a major focal point, and one of the first major public beaches with this scale of architecture in the world. So when we look at the Motor Parkway, or the Eastern Parkway, the Motor Parkway, to our state parkway system, to state parks, in the period of 50 years, we, on Long Island, basically evolved towards an integrated series of settlements with a regional system of recreation. And so recreation, unlike the early part of the 19th century, was no longer community-based. It was spread throughout Long Island, connected by a road through a park. Are there any questions at this point? You ready for the test afterwards? So now I'm going to talk about technology and sustainability, to move on from the technology of transportation. The sustainable precedents that we had on Long Island started with windmills. We had the largest concentration of windmills in North America. And these windmills were used to grind the grain for subsistence farming out east, with most of them from what we would call the Shinnecock Canal on eastward. One was located on Gardiner's Island. That's a picture of the reconstructed. And these are not Dutch. The English had their own style of windmill. The great thing about these windmills is that they basically sat, they were not secured to the ground, they sat on stones that could be leveraged to move the windmill if it was required. Bay houses. How many of you have been to a bay house? Did you like your experience?
A couple of great tours out Long Island Tradition.
Yes, Nancy Solomon.
Yeah.
Did you see any houses with trap doors?
Yes.
Right. So bay houses were built from the 1750s through the end of the 19th century because the people who were fishing and duck hunting needed places to secure themselves when a storm came in. And these houses were either built using derelict boats, or they built them on land and floated them out. The unique nature of these particular structures is that they were built to be portable, they could be detached from their foundations, and they all had trap doors so that when a storm surge came in, the door would open and it would work like a flood vent and hold the house in place. So flood vent technology along the coast was working here at least 200 years before the modern versions of it. And I would consider them to be an ephemeral structure. They're not really planned, they just happen. It's the best way to put it. It's not unlike taking a container and fitting it out. I've been to this house. It's a nice house. Most of the houses that were built, they were forced in the 1920s to build self-contained privies, which is the structure to the side of the main house. Potato barns. Potato barns grew from the experience of people that moved from Poland to Long Island and adopted potatoes as their basis for farming. These structures reflect earthen strategies that they used in Eastern Europe. We see them throughout Long Island. They kind of spread from here to Idaho. And then we have a non-sustainable precedent. What do you think, Gary, a non-sustainable precedent would be for Long Island?
So our typical suburban house?
No. No.
Oh.
Claude?
Suburban sprawl.
Gary? Michael?
Suburban sprawl.
Nah, it's simple. The birth of the big box store. Surprise. Long Island is the home of the first supermarket. So Michael Cullen got a garage on Jamaica Avenue near 171st Street. He gutted it, put glass in it, made sure there was parking to the side, because it was a garage, and opened the first modern supermarket. Separate departments, self-service, chain marketing, and volume dealing. What's a big box store? All of the above. This was the pattern. So we're to blame. And the next time you drive by a BJ's. So I just throw that in. He was very strategic in the way that he placed his stores in the 1930s, and so I want to get some idea of how they were all placed. And finally, the birth of residential construction management, the suburbs. Now, a lot of people don't like the suburbs. I grew up in Levittown. I had a very pleasant experience, and the Levitts, they borrowed a lot of things. I want to just show you some of the things that they borrowed and kind of let you see if you see what I see. We had a group of builders in the Levitts that kind of looked at prototypes that were already in existence. Then they looked at the nature of construction, because prior to the 1940s, you had small builders building anywhere from 4 to 20 houses a year. And some people used kits to kind of get some ability to use the factory to cut down on some of the site production, but nobody did an analysis of a work breakdown structure of how a house goes in. Today, in my modern construction management text that I use for my class, they say there are 10 basic steps. The Levitts had 27. And it involved taking what Ford had done with automobile assembly and saying, we're not going to have a production line that moves. We're going to move the equipment down our production line. And so they were able to take a good prototype, use government support both in design and finance to cut the cost of the money they had to leverage through individual borrowing to get their communities built. And then they developed a supply chain, not only in the field, but nationally, throughout the country. One of the things that influenced Levitt in the adaptation of the prototype that was sponsored by the government was the only house that Frank Lloyd Wright built on Long Island. This house is in Great Neck. It's the Rowan residence. Alfred Levitt spent the summer observing the construction of this house. And the primary takeaways, and I have a comparative slide to explain it, was the relationship of the entry kitchen, fireplace and living room, and the openness of the living room to the outside. Just you can see there, the blue arrow is the entry, the kitchen, and the wet core is there, and then there's a core up above. At the time, that home cost $35,000 to build. When the Levitts built their house, it was less than $6,000 a unit to build. Wright thought that he would be able to build these houses for about $7,000 to $9,000, but he was so fussy about the detailing. And when you sign a contract for a Frank Lloyd Wright designed home, you also give away your right to place furniture. So you really bought a complete package. The federal government started to promote the design of two simple house types in anticipation of recovering from the Depression. The Cape Cod, which when we go back to Long Island, was seen as a house of both durability and tradition. And the gable and wing roof was a modification of that Cape Cod, but when you begin to look at some of the form, you see some of the modern criteria that helps us get to a ranch type, and we'll see that evolution in Levitt right now. So the FHA was promoting basically these two forms, and a lot of the companies like Aladdin, Sears with the Warren, and then the Forgan, all picked up on the basic Cape model. And it was so pervasive that even GE, if you look at this image right here, which is an upside down cape, this is an ad from 1942. So the government had basically aligned their financing and their prototype and their minimum property standards, by the way, which were developed at this time to make sure that houses were durable. All this came together in Levittown. The key things that made Levittown successful as a mass production object was the use of modular dimensional control. 4 feet grid, 4 inches was the critical dimension on any of the dimensional lumber. Placement of the kitchen and the bath in front to reduce piping, and a lot of that work was prefabricating a plant in Roslyn. High window sills and bedrooms for privacy and to reduce the cost of glazing. First use, large scale, of thermopane windows for natural lighting in living rooms. And of course, radiant floor and floor slab without a basement, with a compact potable water boiler that was developed and manufactured right here on Long Island. And we can see this is the FHA home, and kitchen, bath, that technical combination was already made, 2 bedrooms in the back, and then entry to get into the kitchen. This morphed, and they turned the floor plan, put glass walls in the back, kind of made this more like a Wrightian relationship between a fireplace, these 2 spaces, and then a small side corridor to the sleeping areas. We begin to see the reduction of glazing in the bathrooms, large thermopane in the kitchen, and large window wall in the back. And here is my comparison. When you look at entry here, kitchen, wet core, fireplace, kitchen, wet core, fireplace. So there is some partie comparisons that you can make. And you can see in the ranches that were built in Levittown, Pennsylvania, which I have not shown here, I have to do a little bit more review on it. He refined that relationship to look a little bit more like this even further. 27 separate steps that we talked about. And instead of having crews of carpenters and so forth, you had laborers that just did one thing and did it at the same time. They had machines to dig the slabs. They had machines to lay the slabs. They automated as much as they could, so that at the end, a Levitt house being constructed today would cost about $90,000. How many of you can build a simple house for $90,000? One, we don't have that much land on Long Island now, right? What we're looking at is building apartment buildings or small infill strategies. There we might have to take some steps from Levitt and say, well, maybe we need to build offsite, modular or large engineered components and bring those things in to reduce the amount of time. Levitt controlled the supply chain. He had a lumber mill and nail factory in California. He did his offsite fabrication in Roslyn, and then he used the central branch that Stewart had built for just in time. First large-scale use of split ring connectors for roof framing to speed up roof framing with low-skilled workers. First large-scale installation of thermopane windows and the first potable hot water heater. So the boiler not only heated the radiant floor, it provided the hot water for the bath and the sink and so forth. It was a combined unit, no two, and I still have one in place I live. That's what the Levitt house looks like in pieces. That's how organized his supply chain was. How many builders do you know are that organized today? That's just an example of the radiant heat. Of course, most of this failed because the sand and the concrete mix didn't mix well with the piping. And then the two basic houses. So, what are some of the takeaways that I've done in my research that I want to tell you about? That, first of all, intermodal transportation for us as a leader has been going on for over 200 years. From the ferries down in Brooklyn, to the first stage coaches, to the Long Island Railroad, and finally to bridges and our road systems. Our transit-oriented development and resort communities were influenced by kind of that inverse of travel time for work to recreation, and we've dealt with the planning consequences of that for the better part of 100 years. That Robert Moses and the state park system used the lessons from the Olmsted plan and Eastern Parkway and the Vanderbilt Parkway to work with the residential park movement to set a regional planning paradigm that's been copied in other parts of New York and in other parts of the country. Housing mass production, basically we had vernacular converge with residential construction management and adaptation of technological innovation. And then our modern architecture, we have prime examples of experimental communities and figurative design that predate most of the postmodern work that Charles Jenks started to brag about in the 1970s. Now, moving forward from here, we're almost at the end. My next phase of research, we're going to begin to look at some of the accomplishments of these particular individuals in terms of innovation on Long Island. John Kellum was the architect that worked with A.T. Stewart on the design of Garden City. Grosvenor Atterbury designed, as I said, Forest Hills Garden, had patents, and was the chair of the committee that designed the first group of AIA professional contracts. Henry Hoshauser, I talked about, Art Deco movement. Frey and Coker, I'm going to do a little bit more work on the relationship of their buildings out west to our buildings. Moses, we could talk about all night. Why is Oscar Niemeyer on this? Harry asked the question.
Why is he there?
Why is Oscar Niemeyer on this list? One of the topics that I did not cover in this presentation was the World's Fair of 1939-40. There are two things you should know about that World's Fair. One, they had 5 prototypes for the House of Tomorrow that are worth taking a look at and extend some of the work of Frey and Coker. Niemeyer and one of his partners from Brazil designed the Brazilian Pavilion. It is the prototype for Brasilia. I did some, read some citations on how his work here influenced his ability to position himself to gain that commission. Levitt, I need to do more work because he was not only a self-trained architect, but he had extensive interest in horticulture. Geller and Gifford, for those of you that do work on Fire Island and out east, there are books about them. I just want to understand their relationship to the development of modern architecture in Long Island in the 1920s and 30s, and what, if any, ideas or trends did they pick up. So, leaving you with this, that our design and material construction culture relies on looking at the impact of community planning and formation on our architecture and transit. We have housing that drew from our vernacular, supported by the government to make it ubiquitous throughout North America. We have good examples of planning for resiliency that were examples to be used elsewhere along the coast. And obviously we have a good track record of using technology and management innovation to build the communities that we live in now. Are there any questions? Yes, John.
You may want to include Thomas Edison with his concrete houses.
I would, except that those houses were built in New Jersey. I have a whole series of files on him.
Okay, all right. Because Engineering News Record, or Newsweek, about 30 or 40 years ago, they had a pretty good article, which I kept a copy of how they, in early 1900s, 1904 time period, where before that, a lot of immigrants came, so there was a big battle between the wood industry and the concrete industry. What will America be built out of?
Well, so to your point, something that will come into the next version of this presentation is that they just printed a 6,000 square foot house out in Calverton. There's a company, SSD2 in Patchogue, and they were able to print the entire house for under $10,000. So, again, Long Island leading the way, there's an opportunity. And I had the gentleman present to my Materials 2 class. It was fascinating how they're printing buildings. And as architects, we're going to have to do some studies into the means of production to see how design and technology are going to come together, just like BIM is going to affect that boundary between architecture and contract. Anybody else? Thank you.
For this presentation, I certainly learned a lot about Long Island since I didn't go to school in the States. So I'm really happy that I got the chance to hear about all the history in Long Island. And this is
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so
Only
much.
50 bucks.
Thank you everybody for coming tonight. We'll hope to see you in March. We're going to have another session probably regarding codes. So you will be getting an email soon on the location and the date for that session. If you have any questions, any comments, please contact us. We are happy to help out. Thank you.
Thank you.